Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a great day. We're going to make the creating creative estimates and invoices for commercial losses into two parts. So welcome to part one.
Today we're going to talk about creating creative estimates and invoicing for commercial losses. As you can see, as a production coordinator or production manager of a large loss, when you're looking at a large loss, this is sort of what you need to all look at once. And you've got about 30 seconds to do it. So I would encourage you not to put a whole lot of stuff on your plate as you're going into a large loss, because your plate's going to be pretty full all during the day. So as a project manager, I would encourage you for your job to try to attempt to do nothing on a large loss except take care of issues that come your way during the day. So your plan of action for the day should have a big zero beside it. You've got to look at everything that's on this list here that could come your way, and many that I'm sure is not on this list somewhere. Documentation. Where we're going, you don't need documentation. So if you're in the business to make money, then you do need documentation. If you're in the business to lose money, you probably don't need documentation. So you got to decide which side of that fence you're on and whether you want to make money or lose money. Why take the time and utilize manpower for documentation? Well, number one, you make money on labor. Now, a lot of guys I talk to out there, guys and gals both, a lot of companies will come up and say they're in the business to dry buildings, or I'm in the business to do fire and water damage, or I'm in the business to do mitigation, or I'm in the business to do rebuild. No, none of you have got it right if you're saying that. You're in the business to make money. I just think about that for a second. You're in the business to make money. Now, if you don't make money, you're not going to be in business very long to worry about it anyway. So you've got to be in business to make money. So if we're in this business and we're doing mitigation and you need to document stuff, guess what? They're going to agree to pay you to do that. And when they pay you, you're going to make money. So let's talk about how to do that a little bit. I don't know. And the truth is, you don't know how to document stuff. You don't know what each insurance company is going to want from you. And even if you knew how each insurance company wanted it, you're not going to know how each consulting company wanted it. And if you knew how each consulting company wanted it, you're not going to know how the individual consultant for that consulting company is going to want it. So you just don't know. So we're going to talk about how to get around that and how to make that be a workable solution for you. Documentation is material that provides official information or evidence. We want to talk about evidence. Why do we talk about evidence? Because you want to prepare every file that you have as if it was going to court, or if it was going to appraisal, or if it was going to arbitration, or God forbid if you carry it to mediation. So you've got to have your evidence together. So when you're preparing a file, you're not just preparing documentation for the insurance company, you're preparing evidence for your company to get paid on this file. Because after all, remember what you're in the business for. It's to make money. So you've got to do enough documentation to have your evidence together. You have to put together text and photographs and communication and documentation, and you have to do it till you're blue in the face. And don't let that annoy you. Simply put people on the task. If you don't have people on the task, subcontract out your documentation portion of the job, and then you supervise those folks. But get it documented, and you've got to document it well in order to make money. Let's talk about job requirements and part of your documentation. A lot of people refer to the top line on this, the IICRC's S500, which we all know is the water damage standard for the country. When you go out and you decide to make money, which is your job, by doing water damage repair, you're going to follow the guidelines, most likely of the IICRC 500. So you've got to have a scope of work and a plan of action. We refer to that as a drawing plan. Why do we call it a drawing plan? Because the IICRC says you must have a drawing plan. So if you have a scope of work or a plan of action and no drawing plan, you're not following the IICRC's S500. You need legal protection. Well, why do you need legal? Well, you need legal to be able to give you advice during the process of a job. On a lot of these large buildings, you're dealing with lawyers, you're dealing with CEOs, you're dealing with elected officials, maybe of a school board. You're dealing with people who are not your everyday average Joe that you're dealing with. Now, you may be dealing with the maintenance supervisor of a project, but his bosses are the one that's actually dealing with your paperwork. So you have to have a good drawing plan and a good documentation plan. You've got to have something that proves that you did what you said you did. Because if it's not written, it's not done. And just keep that in mind. The benefits of accurate documentation, it reduces your liability. You're like, well, what liability? Well, what if somebody comes up later and says you tore out some floor tile and it had asbestos? Do you have documentation that you had that tested, or do you have documentation that the building already had on file that it did not have asbestos? So the documentation helps reduce liability. You could have any sort of claims, and you're not dealing with one family right now, two adults and a few kids. You're dealing with maybe 100 different adults on the claim, and each one of them may be looking for a reason to have a liability claim against you should any problems arise, or maybe a liability claim against you even if no problems arise. So keep that in mind, but when you have accurate documentation, it helps reduce your liability. It provides integrity for your company when you come up and you're asked a question, and you can have the documentation there that shows shows other people what you actually done. It defines your scope of work. If you have good documentation, which part of that includes scope of work, it's hard for somebody to come back and say, why did you tear this out, or why did you have demolition in this area, and what was the purpose of doing this? So you need good documentation to do that. So what's your process? I want to talk about processes a good little bit. As I stated just a little earlier, each individual consultant or a company and each individual consultant wants work a certain way. But you're not working for that consultant, and you're not working for the insurance adjuster, and you're not working for the insurance company. You're working with all those folks, but you're working for the building owner. Now, what you're going to get if you try to change your process for each and every adjuster or each and every consultant is you're going to get in a big mess. First place, on most large losses, you will have more than one adjuster. You'll have more than one consultant. It'll typically start out with an adjuster that has a small limit, and he won't be able to stay on the job too long because he knows that that's going to exceed his limit. So you start out with one guy for 2 or 3 days, and after that, you'll get a different guy. And then a lot of times you may get a third one, and you do that on some very large jobs. And each one of those people are going to have a different process that they're going to want you to follow. So your best defense and your best documentation is to follow your process. Could you imagine getting on a Southwest Airlines plane to take a flight to Washington State, and you go to the cockpit and say, listen, pilot, I understand you usually go to Dallas and then up through Colorado and then you go on into Washington, but today we're not going to do that. I want you to go straight to Washington. And by the way, I want to know what you're making. I want to know what the flight attendants are making. I want to know how much fuel we're going to use and what that's going to cost. And you want to confront him about this after the flight and see how that goes along. Of course you don't do that. Each airline has a process. They even have little lines painted out on the tarmac where they park and everything else. They have a very, very, very defined process. They don't care who's flying on their plane. They don't care who's talking to them. They follow their process. You need to be the same way. You're the owner of the business, most likely, or one of the principals of the business. You should know that if you had 10 jobs going at once, which might be a heavy load for you, it may be a light load, but if you had 10 jobs going at once and you have 10 different processes, how would you keep up with that? And let's say that you're very intelligent and you could. How are your people going to keep up with that? I mean, it's like asking them to do their job differently, for 10 different jobs out of a day. So define your process and stay with your process. And when these adjusters or consultants or folks come up and ask you to change your process, you say, no, this is our process. This is the way we're doing it. And hand them your process package that tells them your drawing plan and how you're going to proceed with the project. It says, I'm dying of a heart attack. I should have flossed. It's a little too late to worry about that now, okay, if that's the truth. But you're going to get everything out of these consultants. You're going to get everything out of these adjusters. So we've all been dealing with the pandemic and the Chinese flu or the COVID or whatever verbs you want to call it. So we're all familiar now with the CDC, and that's the Center for Disease Control, the CDC. Well, in our business, that stands for contracts, documentation, and communication. Contracts, documentation, and communication. And without those three things, you're not going to get paid. And if you do, you're going to get paid a severely reduced amount. And you may have done a great job drawing the building, but if you have to argue and fight after your money, you're not going to be happy, and neither is the property owner, because he's going to be involved in the fight that you're having, and you're not going to make any money. It's going to get reduced, and any amount reduced is coming straight off of your bottom line. So if you have good contracts, good documentation, and good communication, then it will increase your bottom line. The words information and communication are often interchanged, but they're quite different one way. Information is when you're giving information out. You're giving people information. I'm giving you a report. Communication is getting through to people. It'd be like listening to a politician give you a speech about any topic that you can think of. So he's giving you information. But if he's communicating with you, he's giving some information and he's receiving some information. So that is an open line of communication. So you can't just simply send the building owner and then subsequently the adjusters and consultants an email and expect that you're communicating, because at that point you're only giving information unless you're getting feedback from them. Once again, as the project manager's job, you're coping with a lot of things at once. I say the word penalties up there up front. I say rules, regulations, courts, statutes, permits, enforcements, policies, implied and written consent. Lord, they got the word criminal up there. Safety, lawmakers, all kinds of things you got to deal with. And this page just scratches the bottom of the barrel. And you say, well, that's not true. How can you do a job and be criminal? I've had to deal with the police on several jobs, several times, code enforcements and regulations about blocking alleys or streets or whatever you've got to do to get on the job and get equipment set up. So a lot of things you've got to put on your plate to do that, and you need to document each one of those things, because each one of these things you do, any regulation that you have to abide by, any statutes you have to abide by, any federal laws you have to abide by, that all costs you money. So guess what? You need to make money on that item, because we are in the business of making money. We're not in the business of drying buildings. So if I have to pay the police department to put up barricades across the street and pay them to watch that, then we're simply going to add that to the bill. So you got a lot of work to do. You have to know the rules. Now, if you're in a given county or given state, that gets pretty easy, because of the time you do several jobs, you know the rules fairly well. However, if you're one of these people that do a lot of traveling, you go to different states, different provinces, you storm chase, whatever you want to call it, then it's hard to keep up with the rules. And that gets back to the slide we talked about a little bit earlier ago about your legal team. So you need to have your legal team on your speed dial button, where you can call them and say, look, I'm going to this state this day. What are the rules and regulations that I need to know? Now, hopefully you've pre-planned and your legal team has a binder for a lot of the states that you suspect you may go into, and they've already looked up some information for you, and they've got that information at their fingertips. A lot of things you'll need to know about different rules. Another thing, if you're going to a ball game, let's say you were going and playing croquet, and you didn't know anything about croquet. If you didn't know the rules, there's no way you could win the croquet game. There's no way you could do it. You have to know the rules better than your opponent knows the rules. So learn the rules of the game. If you're going to be in water damage, and if you're going to reference the IICRC's S500, number one, know what the IICRC stands for. And number two, know what the S500 is. And you need to know that book better than any adjuster or any consultant that you'll ever meet. You need to have it on your speed dial number on your computer, but you also need to be really familiar with it. You don't need to be able to not answer a question to them. What's the difference between Category 2 and Category 3? You need to know that information. You don't need to get them to question you, where's your drying plan? You need to know that you've got a drying plan. So know the rules of the game. Be detailed in that aspect of it, and make it easy. I mean, you don't want to have 6 million rules and enforce 1 million of them. You want to have as few rules as possible, but then enforce the rules that you do have. Your communications and your documentation needs to be up to date. Old communication is not valuable at all. That becomes information. Because if you tell me about something you done 3 days ago or 3 weeks ago, it has no value to me whatsoever except historical data. So you've got to keep your information and your communications up to date. Your communications should be easy to find and easy to contribute to. Keep your job numbers in your subject line. Keep maybe the claim number in the subject line if the building owner wants you to deal with claims and claims numbers. And some building owners may want you to copy the consultants and adjusters. Some may not want you to talk to the consultants and adjusters. Keep in mind, you work for the building owner. All your communications should be directed to the building owner, and then if he asks you to copy it to others, then you can feel free to do so in most cases. In some states, you may violate the UPPA, I believe it is, unlicensed public adjusters. You may also violate the laws of attorneys practicing law without a license. So you have to be careful as a contractor what you can do and what your laws are in in your different state and what they're enforcing there. So be careful about that. It goes back to knowing the rules of the game, know the rules of the game and what you should do. But when you submit documentation and communication, it should be in a timely manner and it should be easy to find. And it should be consistent. If you're writing a report, you want to see pretty much the same report every day with the changes in it. You don't want to send them at 6 o'clock in the morning one day and 6 o'clock at night the next, and vice versa. So keep everything consistent. Try to keep it in a timely manner, and be consistent with your reporting and what you're doing. Some of the required documents on commercial losses, on pretty much every commercial loss that you go out and do, probably residential is all, but the first thing you need is a work authorization or a contract, could be referred to. Your contract or work authorization has to include a scope of work, and it has to include how much you're charging or a rate schedule. And if you don't have your scope of work and your rate schedule and a good general understanding in your contractual work authorization, you don't have what is referred to in a legal sense as a meeting of the minds. And if you don't have a meeting of the minds, you don't have a good contract. It is your responsibility, if you're presenting the contract, to make your contract clear and understandable so that the policyholder, the building owner, whatever you want to call it, can understand it, because you are the author of the contract and you bear the burden of that. Another thing you're going to need is psychometric readings. We all know that psychometric readings are atmospheric readings for the most part. They temperature, relative humidity, which is converted into grains. A lot of your adjusters and 3-day trained consultants will get the psychometric and the moisture content readings confused with each other. So you have to make your communication in such a manner they can understand those. You need moisture content readings. You need moisture maps to show where your moisture content readings relate to the building, which gives documentation and proof of why you have drying equipment in that general area of the building. So you would need to keep up with all that. Instead of a water damage restoration plan, you need a drying plan, because the IICRC says you must have one. You need environmental reports and tests, and maybe in the same sentence recommendations from experts. That's asbestos testing, that's mold testing, that may or may not involve a structural engineer that you may need on some jobs, and just a host of different other things, other experts that come in, a roofing expert, a commercial HVAC expert, food and beverage expert in a facility with food and beverage. So a lot of different experts that you may have to recommend to get in there to help you do the job. Don't try to wear these hats if you don't have the knowledge. You will fall on your face trying to do that in a commercial setting if you're trying to stumble through it. You can fool some of the people all the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. So if you need an expert in something, get an expert in there. So another expert would be contents and personal property inventories. You may have a couple of people on your staff that can do that, but what if you need 100? Do you have 100? So no, you need to have that lined up previously. You need to have somebody come in and do that on a commercial property that's much larger and much more detailed. Lien notices and lien releases, and might even add into their lien filings. Gets back to our conversation about legal. In my opinion, if you're the smartest person in the industry, or you're even an attorney, if you're talking about placing a lien on somebody's building for your behalf, you need to have a specialized attorney do that, or maybe a specialized closing company, title company, I think they're called, to be able to do that for you. When you place a lien on a property, a lot of times, or most of the time, it will violate the mortgage on the property, which means the mortgage holder could foreclose on the property. In most all instances, having a lien placed on a property, if you're renting it, will violate the lease agreement that you have, which could cause somebody to lose their lease. That will come with extremely high liabilities for you if it's done incorrectly. So when you have a lien filed, you need to make sure you're using the proper people to do the proper research and that they're meeting guidelines and timelines and stuff such as that to keep you out of a big legal mess on it. So just more and more and more documentation. I know what you're saying. As a building owner or a business owner, you want to get out and you want to drive building, and that's what you got in this for, not to be a pencil pusher. And we understand that. So hire somebody that can do it for you, either within your staff or outside of your staff. And if they're within your staff, make sure that they have people lined up to jump in and help them should they get overwhelmed. Change orders. Sometimes you can do change orders by emails. Sometimes change orders need to be an individual written document. Some of that's going to depend what state you're in. Again, know the rules of the game. We talked about that. Example would be Ohio. If you're working for a municipality or a public entity, your change order's got to be a separate document signed by all parties before any work is performed that has to do with that change order. In most other states, you can simply do a change order over email and get an approval on it and go on down the road. There's weird laws in a lot of weird states, and different laws maybe is a more proper way of putting it, but you got to know the rules of the game. If you're traveling, that's where that legal team comes in, that you can find out stuff like that. Invoices, we're going to talk about timelines on those here in just a little bit, as well as reimbursable expenses. Some more documents going to be required are labor logs, signed or electronic, daily summaries. We talked about communication being timely. We have to do that at minimal once a day. Now, on the other hand, you can't make them too timely. You can't send somebody something, 3 times an hour. You overwhelm them and it gets overlooked and people don't pay attention to it. So you need to do daily summaries in a timely manner, but you need to choose a time of day that you're going to get your daily summary out and be consistent and do it pretty much, all day, every day, at the same time when you can. Equipment logs and consumable logs sort of go without saying. Just make sure you keep up with what equipment you're using on the job, what consumables you're using. Subcontractors, a little bit of caution there. Just because a subcontractor comes in and charges you $20,000 to do a job, don't mean you're going to get paid $20,000 for it. So be a little bit cautious with your subcontractors in that respect, that their pricing needs to fall within your guidelines. Now, if their pricing does not fall within your guidelines, then you need the change order we talked about. But the last thing you want to do is pay a subcontractor $20,000 to do something, and then you wind up not being able to recoup that money for that. So have good contracts with your subcontractors also. I know we want to get the job done and we get in a hurry, but good contracts are like good fences, making good neighbors. They're a must to be successful in business. So if you're going to use biocides in a building, communications and approval of that's a great thing to have. Safety meetings. Every morning when your line crews up, you want to have a safety meeting. We're talking 60 seconds here. I mean, your guys today, we're going to be working on ladders, taking ceiling tile down. We want you to wear gloves while you're taking your ceiling tile down. And if you're going to get above the 3rd step of the ladder, have someone support the ladder while you're climbing it. Thank you. And That's our safety meeting and topic for today. Pressure readings on negative air jobs, on mold jobs, or jobs where you're going to do containment's important. Photo documentation, we're going to talk about a little bit more further down the road, but it's really important. So, written communications, always important.
Okay, guys, he was saying written communication is always important, and we're going to touch more on that next time. And this is going to complete part 1 of this. So we will see you next time for part 2.